Hello and welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League. The League of Women Voters St. Paul presents these hour-long programs for our community once a month. My name is Nona Beining, and I am chair of the membership committee, League of Women Voters board member, and an active member of the program committee. I'll be moderating tonight's presentation on the firearms study by our guest speaker, Marti Micks. I'd love to give a big thank you to White Bear Lake area and Roseville area leagues for their support for tonight's talk. We'd also like to thank the St. Paul Neighborhood Network for broadcasting and taping tonight's program. You can check out League of Women Voters St. Paul YouTube site and watch previous programs anytime. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens league to improve our government and engage all our citizens. The League is a nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to you, our community. We study issues, we take positions, and we take action. Check out our website to learn more about membership in the League of Women Voters, and we welcome new members throughout the year, so please give us a try. Our program is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live, so if you're watching there, please put your questions for the speaker in the comment section, and if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the talk. Also, we're using Zoom closed caption feature, so comments or the closed captioning is auto-generated. It might not be exact. We'd like to start out with the acknowledgement that we're learning today on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people and current home of several Native nations, including the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities, and we hope that our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Part of the role the League plays in our nation's governance is to tackle complex topics, study and discuss them, and eventually come to an accepted policy position. Again, we study issues, we take positions, and we take action. In that spirit, some background on this topic. The Firearms Update Study Committee of the State League discovered in its research that the landscape surrounding firearms violence has changed significantly since the 1990 League of Women Voters State Firearms Study. Therefore, this update study was approved at the 2019 State Convention. A committee convened and is recommending a set of updates to the firearms position. Local league delegates will be given the opportunity to vote on the resolutions at the council on April 30th. We're very fortunate tonight to have longtime leaguer and civic leader Marti Micks talk us through this. Marti is a retired social studies teacher from the Osseo School District. She served 8 years on the Golden Valley City Council and Housing Redevelopment Authority and was a civilian management analyst for the U.S. Army at Rotterdam, the Netherlands. The League member since 1976, Marti has served as president of the State League from 2018 to 2019 and has served on several studies, including CMAL, which is the Council of Metropolitan Area Leagues. Ms. Micks is a co-chair of the State Firearms Update Study Committee and president of the League of Women Voters Golden Valley. She'll highlight some common misconceptions of firearm violence and review statistical information and some that the committee found. Welcome, Marti.
Thank you. I am now trying to, excuse me, something is making it so I can't get to my, let's see. Okay. All right, I think I've got it now. All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
We sure can.
Well, great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm so glad that you are all here today. I guess I wanted to start out with a couple of questions. And do mass shootings account for a large percentage of firearms? I forgot to put the question mark. Do most mass shootings occur in schools? Is it true that over 90% of cities in Minnesota have no firearm homicides during a given year? Is the rate of firearm violence greater now than it was in the mid-1990s? Are most firearm deaths by suicide? Are most police shootings of Black males? These are some questions that we'll see if we know the answers to by the end of this. One of the things in our study committee, many of us really didn't have a lot of background in firearms, and some did, but we found that this gun violence archive had a nice research on the deaths and suicides that occurred each year. And you can look up every incident they have, and you can find out all the details of each of these incidents. It's really quite in depth. One thing you'll notice though is that the numbers of deaths have increased from 2014 to 2020. That's up 7,000. Suicides have gone up, but not as high a percentage. And you'll see here on this, they're doing it a little differently now. And I thought I would show, this is the year 2020 and this is the year 2021. And there has been they've decided to separate mass shootings into mass murders versus mass shootings. And that's because if you want to have research on a topic like mass shootings, you need to know what is the definition. There is no agreed upon definition of mass shootings. The FBI is, I think, the one that I'll go with, and they say the mass shooting is 4 or more shot in a single event. And they will say that event could be in the home, outside, anywhere. Some definitions of mass shootings only count shootings that happen outside the home. And mass murders are 4 or more killed in a given event. You'll notice that they do have also the number of officer involved in incidents where the officer's been killed or the subject has been killed. This is a cartoon that was given me by one of the other committee members. And many times when people think if they have a gun in the home that it will make their home safer, but actually a gun in the home can triple the risk of a homicide. It could be the child that's killed accidentally. We've been hearing in the news about children that are killed by a brother or accidentally shot by another person. It increases the likelihood of suicide because when there's a suicide, they say that you have 10 minutes that a person might change their mind within a 10-minute period. And if they're doing some method other than a gun, they could actually get help. But a gun kind of finalizes the situation. And an abused woman is 5 times more likely to be murdered if there is a gun in the home. And if there's any questions as I go along, feel free to ask. This is a graph done by Pew Research Center, and they're a nonpartisan group. And you'll see that looking across the lines here, we still are lower than we were certainly in the 70s. And you'll notice that there was a peak up here in about 1994, 1995, where the suicides were much higher, and also the homicides as well. Now, this is a map showing the fire mortality, a comparison among the states. And just in case it's a little hard to see, this very light cream color are the states that have the lowest firearm mortality. Now, firearm mortality includes both homicides and suicides. And then they also have stricter gun laws, by the way. And then the other states, the yellow ones, we're the next lowest, starting at 8.44 to 13.48 people killed by firearms per 100,000 population. And Minnesota is actually 8.44. So we're almost in that lighter zone. You'll notice that the states that have more deaths, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have more murders, but like Montana and Wyoming have very high suicide rates, which puts theirs up high. And then the South, the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Missouri, Alaska, and Alabama are all have the highest rates of firearm fatalities. And yeah, I'm just gonna show you just the death rate, how much lower they are than the other states. They range from 3.4 up into like 24 per 100,000. So we're really, Minnesota's right here at 8.9. And so we could be better, but we're really doing pretty good compared to the other states. And this is our homicide rate in Minnesota. This is total homicides of all of these. 75% were by firearm in 2020. And the others ranged anywhere from 69% to 80%. But you can see that we're still, our homicide rate per 100,000 is definitely below 1995, but it is above 2000 and it's above 2005. So it's like we're going back to the 1990s unless we can intervene in this period of violence. Sadly, the population who are African American have suffered the most with the deaths of over 107 people last year were murdered who are African American. In the years before that, they were, it's only like 63, and the year before that is only 41. And these are just raw numbers. These are not rates or percentages. And you can see that the COVID, the killing of George Floyd, had an impact on the rate of firearm homicides in Minnesota. It affected both Blacks and whites, not so much for the Indian, Alaska, or Asian groups. The one thing that was shocking to me when we were doing a first study, or first starting to interview police and sheriffs, is we were surprised that they were saying that the impact of firearms in their community was usually related to, if it was a death, it was usually a suicide. And they weren't talking about homicides. And so we got the data from the Department of Health, and 77% of the deaths by firearms were suicides in Minnesota, and homicides are only 19%. That has changed this year. We're down to 75% suicides and up to 21% homicides. So it's switching around a little bit. Nationally, the suicide rates vary widely by race and gender. Most of the suicides are all males. 29.8 white males per 100,000 have committed suicide in a given year, and Black males are about half that number, and Hispanic males are a little less, and Asian males a little less. And then we get all the way down, the females are lower, and with the Black females having the very lowest suicide rate. And this is just all suicides, not just by firearms. So answers to these statements. are in red. So do mass shootings account for a large percentage of firearm homicides? So depending on the definition, they account for less than 1 to up to 3% of all homicide gun deaths. And are most mass shootings in school? No. When definition includes domestic violence and gang violence, most are in homes. In Minnesota, 53% of the mass shootings are in homes, and most of them are domestic violence with some gang violence that will happen in homes as well. It's usually related to some kind of, some kind of drug thing where they're wanting to go to that home to get the drugs. And when it excludes domestic violence or gang crime, then most are in the workplace, followed by schools. And quite often we never think of the place of employment as being a place to be worried about, but that is where there are the next highest number of mass shootings. And is it true that over 90% of cities in Minnesota have no firearm homicides during a given year? Yes, 92% in 2020. And again, I talked earlier about that the rate of firearm violence now is not greater than it was in the mid 1990s. Not even with this current spike is it higher than that. So, and again, firearm deaths by suicide, that is most of them, although it's 75% in Minnesota now. Nationally, it is also the largest cause of firearm deaths. And there had been some questions about our draft study didn't really talk about the police interactions and by race. And so I thought I'd just throw this in here. And most of the shootings are of whites, although if you look at percentages, then that's a different matter. But most are whites and most are actually in outside the metropolitan area. You can see here by the police shootings of persons, there were 11 fatalities, and there was one, each of these had one from Blue Earth, Cass County, Carver, Dakota, Nicollet, Pine, St. Louis County, Minneapolis, North Mankato PD, and St. Cloud Police Department, St. Paul Police Department each had one. There were some woundings where they were not killed, but they were wounded, and 2 in Brooklyn Park, and the rest were all one person, and this is in 2020. And most of these interactions are people who they're interacting with are either impaired through drugs, through alcohol, or are having a mental health crisis. And that is one of the more common things, and cause, resisting arrest for various reasons. Were there any questions about those headlines at all so far? I'm curious to see if there's anything that I should answer before we go on to some of the major changes that have occurred since 1990.
We have a couple questions, but I think they are appropriate to hold till the end, nothing specifically related, Marti.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Oops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. The biggest change that has really occurred here, and I don't know, I hope you can't see this chat thing that just suddenly appeared on my screen. But the second,
Good, Marti.
huh?
It's all good, thanks.
Okay, yeah, it's interfering with my screen, so I can't see it. Okay, let me just see if I can. Oh, there, now I can take this off. Okay. The Second Amendment, for 200 years was interpreted as a collective right. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And then in 2008, the District of Columbia versus Heller created a major shift in the views of the right to have a firearm. And Heller interpreted the Second Amendment as an individual right rather than collective to keep and bear arms. But he was the majority opinion writer, and he said that it was not an absolute right. And by the way, it was not Heller who was, I meant to say wasn't it Scalia? Anyway, McDonald versus City of Chicago was the court case that extended the individual right to keep and bear arms to state and local laws. So that then affected many states and localities that had some fairly strict laws that didn't allow for possession of maybe a firearm in their city. And this made it so that they couldn't make a law like that. The thing that's coming up currently that will be heard before or by June, we'll hear the outcome of this particular case. It's the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Bruin is the state attorney general. Will decide whether New York State has the right to require that a person show a need for protection to carry a concealed weapon outside the home. And this New York statute has been in effect since 1913. So if they rule against the state of New York on their statute, that really is overturning another concept of our legal system, and that is to honor precedent. So we will see how that turns out, but keep your eyes peeled for news about their Supreme Court's ruling on this particular case, because it will have large implications on what kind of legislation states could have, or cities. And other major federal firearm laws since 1990 was the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993. It required federal background checks to purchase a firearm from a federally licensed dealer. And I underlined federally licensed dealer because this act specifically said a federally licensed dealer. Therefore, if you bought a gun from a friend or from a relative, you didn't have to go through a background check. So, but this act set up the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, and it's maintained by the FBI. So it took in effect completely by about 1998. In 1994, in the mid 1990s, our country was really suffering from a high rate of firearm violence. And there was this very super big bill that passed. It's a very large omnibus bill that included the banning of semi-automatic assault weapons for 10-year period. And it made it unlawful to transfer, possess large capacity ammunition magazines for 10 years. And this part of the act was not renewed and expired in 2005. The parts about this act, though, that really did have an impact, they started funding community-oriented policing. They funded the ability of cities to hire extra police if they needed. And they also put a large amount of money in gun violence prevention through community-based groups to work to address some of the causes of the gun violence that was going on. And this brought down our crime rate, which was a good thing to see. And another thing, though, that they did pass was the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act of 2005. And it prohibited gun manufacturers and dealers from being named in civil lawsuits when crimes are committed involving their firearms. Obviously, you can still sue a gun company if your gun is not functioning properly, but it can't. They were doing that, I think, to make sure that this particular group wasn't going to get sued like we've seen with the tobacco companies. So that also, what's interesting is right now the country of Mexico is suing firearms manufacturers. So we'll see what's happening with that to see if there's going to be how the Supreme Court will rule on that, or if they're going to take the case. Minnesota firearm laws since 1990 have also made some changes. We now have a negligent storage of firearms. So it's a gross misdemeanor for a person to store or leave a loaded firearm where a child under 18 years is likely to gain access. And requires firearm dealers to post signs about this and warning them to store their firearms safely. It does not require that they store their firearms separate from their ammunition. Some states do have that. A permit to purchase is required in Minnesota to purchase either a handgun or a semi-automatic military style assault weapon. The permit to purchase a handgun is kind of, that all came about with the Brady thing, but the semi-automatic military style assault weapon, some states did not require that. Minnesota did require that you also need a permit to purchase that, which means you have to go through that FBI check to make sure that you are eligible to purchase a gun. The Minnesota Personal Protection Act of 2003 is also known as the permit to carry, allows persons to who are eligible to possess a handgun to apply for this permit. And it allows a permit holder to take their gun with them to all places that don't expressly forbid guns. Currently, there are 358,897 valid permit holders in Minnesota. Last year, over 100,000 people applied for a permit and 96,000 were granted that permit. So not everybody who applies gets one. But the year before, there were only, I believe it was 56,000 who had applied. So we noticed that when we were interviewing police and sheriff, that they were commenting on the large amount of people that they were applying to get a permit to carry, and a lot of large amounts of permits to purchase applications that they also had to do the background checks for. So this was overwhelming some of the sheriff departments. Trends and innovation in firearm technology. Obviously, things don't stay the same, and firearms are more versatile and more accurate, more deadly, and more affordable now. And there are some technologies to make firearms safer. There's not as likely to fire randomly. There's smart guns that fire only if used by authorized owner, although that is not quite as popular because sometimes that thumbprint or that fingerprint won't work, or a drop safety. And that's something that, you know, would be a positive, so that guns don't fire if dropped accidentally. On the right here is a 3D printed gun. And, you know, we didn't really hear too much about the 3D guns until our second year of researching this. And cities like New York City and in California, where they do have some fairly restrictive gun laws, we're finding that these 3D printed guns were appearing in about 40% of their crimes. So that is, and they're called, any gun that doesn't have a serial number in it, that didn't ever have a serial number, is kind of included as a ghost gun. I put this here, not to scare you, but it did kind of surprise me. There is a corner shot technology that the military is using in Israel. And then of course, I guess it's spreading throughout the world, but it does make one a little nervous about certain kinds of technology. On the right here, this was a company, the Culpeper Company, and they decided, maybe as a marketing gimmick, to create a gun. Basically, it was a Glock that they actually put real Legos on the outside, and the Lego toy company objected, and the gun is no longer marketed. And there's lobby groups that work to impede enforcement of new gun laws. And the one here in Minnesota is the gunowners.min, and they are trying to create sanctuary counties and sanctuary cities. And in the metro area, they have groups working in each one of the counties except for Hennepin County and Carver, but Ramsey County has a group there working to try to get the commissioners and sheriff on board. But so far they have not signed on to it. Only 11 counties have actually adopted Second Amendment statements, resolutions saying that they will not enforce any further firearms legislation that would restrict guns in any way. One thing we noticed, one of the committee members was a professor and psychologist and was very concerned about the lack of gun violence research. And back in 1996, there was a Dickey Amendment, which essentially stopped gun violence research by prohibiting the Centers for Disease Control giving any funds for research that could be turned around as creating an advocacy for gun control. And because of this has caused researchers to back off the issue altogether, because when you're researching, you don't know how the outcome is going to be. And they just didn't want to fear losing funding. So they just did not do anything. So after 23 years without giving money for gun violence research, Congress in 2019 did allocate $25 million for gun violence research, which, you know, it's not a lot of money when you consider how expensive a lot of the research can be. And this was one thing that I found interesting because it is from a UN global study, and it is it covers all the continents, and it seems that there is like a one kind of similarity in every single group. When homicides are high, it affects the ability of young people to learn in school. And it, you know, if you affect the learning in school and you don't have people graduating high school with any skills, it reduces your chances of high quality job. And so homicides can actually lead to poor education, and poor education is kind of an infinity thing because they both can become a vicious cycle. And this UN study found that you can actually turn this around, and they talk about the vicious circle, the one you don't want to be caught in, and that's where crime is increasing, you know, murders are increasing, and, you know, education is really losing out. And then to the virtuous circle where things are turning around. So they say the first thing is that you have to make sure that people are not getting away with crime. And how you can do that is to increase trust with the police, and to make sure that then you don't overstretch the capacity of the criminal justice system. Because once, you know, well, we saw that in our interviews that the courts were not being very good about getting information into the data for the sheriffs and the police to check on information, because the courts were so backlogged on their paperwork. And then the virtuous circle, of course, is strengthening the rule of law, building trust in the with their police, and you have a more efficient criminal system when you have less murders. And then you also have, with trust in police and people feeling that they can actually report what they see, there's less people that are getting away with the crimes, which means if you have less people getting away with it, then less people do it. So then that you have a lower homicide rate. And I think we're getting towards the end here. The one thing that we also found was that there's evidence-based violence reduction strategies and programs that have been used and are being used. Public health approach is the way the CDC is now putting that on their website, to view firearm violence as a contagion that must be traced and interrupted. And that means that you can actually have gun intervention or firearm intervention programs through even the hospitals, you know, when they first go to the hospital for treatment for gun wounds, you know, to work with them to see if we will, you know, report how this happened, and try to get the information and kind of get them away from the groups that are committing the violence. And school-based violence prevention strategies are very helpful to get young people to work to resolve their differences, and to build a sense of self-esteem so that they're less likely to fall prey to shooting somebody because they feel disrespected. And family support and counseling to reduce violence in the home between both partners, and also to reduce child abuse and homicides, because children, if it's not disease related, young children can often, one reason that they die is of homicides from their family. And then reducing the number of illegally held firearms. We have a lot of firearms right now that are in the hands of people that should not have them. In fact, in our interviews that we did with police and sheriff, they said for the most part, most of the crimes of violence were, if it's domestic violence, they usually own that gun legally. But if it was a crime like their robberies and they shoot somebody in a robbery, that those were not legally held firearms. And then the other recommendation was to reduce homicides, was to get young males in schools, vocational training or employment to reduce homicide rate, because of over 80% or 86% of all the firearms offenders homicide offenders are males. And even if we're looking at suicides, that is also males who are the largest group. So I'm going to stop the share. Should I continue here to talk about the position that the state league has currently?
Why don't you go ahead and go through this, because it'll lead nicely into that first set of questions about our process and what we're intending to get out of this.
All right, thank you. Back in 1990, when the league had their position statement written, they had a background check they supported a background check for the purchase of long guns, handguns, and assault weapons. Our study committee to update the firearms position suggested that we put the wording and support universal background checks. I capitalize that just so we understand that this is to not just be limited to federally licensed dealers, but to any person who is selling or transferring the firearms, so that there would be a background check required. I did talk to a gun dealer in our area, and he said that it's not a big deal, that they quite often are also at the gun shows, and they'd be more than happy to do the background checks for other people there at the gun shows, because he said it only takes a few minutes to do the background check. And then the current position we have is the licensing of long guns, handguns, and assault weapons. The co-chair of the committee looked at that and she says, oh my gosh, that was a mistake. We don't license the weapons, we license the person. You register the weapons, but so the proposed change would be to support the licensing of firearms purchasers or transferees. Transferees covers it, so that if you aren't selling it, but you're giving it to somebody, or you are loaning it to somebody, that there should be some sense that there has to be some background check on that. And then to expand the League of Women Voters Minnesota definition of firearms to include ghost guns and ghost gun kits. So ghost gun kits they're not called that. Actually, if you go to buy one, they're gun kits that are 80% complete, with 80% completed frames of receivers. And those are kind of the guts of a gun. And they only with a drill and a few other items, you could actually get the gun put together in about an hour. And then finally, our current position statement for the rest of it. I'll read it. Registration of League supports registration of long guns, handguns, and assault weapons. That wording would probably be changed to registration of firearms. Ban on the manufacture, sale, and importation of assault weapons and assault weapon parts. The concept of gun owner liability when others are harmed due to the owner's negligence. By the way, for the permits to carry, there are now, to have a permit to carry, you also have to have pass a certification that you have been trained for firearm safety. And there are organizations to do the firearm safety, and some that will try to kind of lure people by saying that they will also offer a low cost insurance for the gun owner in case there's a lawsuit of liability when others are harmed. Local municipalities' ability to regulate ownership and possession of firearms and ammunition more strictly than state law allows. And I just repeated that. I did not realize that. And then League of Women Voters Minnesota opposes an amendment to the Constitution of the state of Minnesota, granting an individual the right to bear arms. Our committee, had a lot of disagreement on some of these things, and we interviewed the police and sheriff. There was a couple that gave pretty compelling reasons that they should not be in our statement. So we'll see. But this one here on the bottom, Connecticut has a Second Amendment, and it also has one of the strongest set of firearms laws in the country. So it doesn't mean that if you have that you can't have laws that can be more protective of the communities. I think that is it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Marty. That was a lot of information, and we've got a lot of really good questions coming in. We've got about 15 or 16 minutes left, and I want to kind of group the questions into a couple different camps. First, we've got a few questions about the study itself. What is the process? Who's the committee? And what's the makeup of that? And then, if you could spend a couple minutes just talking about the process that you went through to do this research and, cite some of the sources and the interviewees, I think that would be really wonderful. And then from there, we'll turn to, the nuts and bolts of some of the statistics and other kind of surprising facts that we learned today. So could you talk about the process a little bit?
Yeah, the process was, when we first gathered together, there was a very wide diversity of people on the committee. And one who suggested that, well, let me backtrack. I had just worked on a CMAL study where we were interviewing city planners and mayors and city managers. And I found it so invigorating, and for all of our leagues to at least have more visibility. And I thought, how can we do this to kind of engage the other local leagues to get interested in this study? And so we had, in fact, you have a member in St. Paul who did interview of Todd Axtell of St. Paul, your police chief. And this is where we started finding out, first, do all the cities and counties, do they all report their data to the FBI? Well, we found out that they all report to the BCA, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and then the BCA then reports from there to the FBI. There's 420 law enforcement agencies that do the reporting, and of those 420, 417 reported all their statistics last year. It's a voluntary thing, and perhaps the other 3 didn't have any firearms things to report, but I just wanted you to know that it's 417 of our 420 did report. And it was through the interviews that we were wondering, why aren't they being truthful about the impact of firearms? And we found out that actually many of the cities they just didn't have any homicides in their cities, even some cities that had some fairly larger populations. We then started we split it up and started going in different directions. One person, Florence Sprague, was doing all of our study work on the judicial aspect, and another one, Judy Jones, was researching all the technology changes in guns, and then Mary Santee of White Bear Lake and Kay Slama of Wilmer were looking at the behavioral science research relating to firearms. And Mary Louise Groh, who had been on the original Firearms Committee in 1990, wanted to really research domestic terrorism, because domestic terrorism has changed from what it was back in the 60s. We have militia groups that are in Minnesota now. I think there's about 11 groups that gather together, and some are anti-government, some are maybe just more white supremacist groups. But anyway, that was kind of the beginnings of the committee work. And we evidently went beyond the scope, which means we didn't get to ask all the consensus questions and do work that we'd hoped to do, but we have the study research done, and it's just a matter, we would welcome any new members to our committee, because we have people who are tired and would love to have some extra help. But most of the work is done. It's just looking with your fresh eyes. So.
Well, that's a lot of work and a lot of interviews. It sounds like for, you said 2 years it's taken to kind of go through all the piles of data, conduct the interviews, and discuss, some of the other studies that you've cited.
Yes.
Throughout this, now let's pivot a little bit, and I apologize to any of the people who've asked questions very specifically, but I think we have a collection of questions that ask about ammunition or clip sizes and the things that we see in the headlines, right? And I know that you started out when we were, when you were presenting mortality rates in Minnesota, and it's overwhelmingly suicide. So it seems, appropriate that we titled this Beyond the Headlines, that, we think that perhaps some things are more important or a bigger issue than they are. But you must have, I'm sure, during the study process, understood some of the controversies or the legislation around ammunition and clip sizes. And, is there anything going on right now to talk about that?
Not any current legislation right now, but there have been several states do have regulations regarding clip sizes and such. Does it prevent people from not following? We did learn that many people who don't follow the law and use the guns for homicides also don't follow the law for everything else. We're hearing people now who've gotten little series that can create a rapid fire on their firearms. So there's a lot of, I guess you just want to make sure that people are in a better spot mentally, that we're not having people so angry at each other. We have to really look at how to calm the communities down.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple comments about something that just aired on PBS NewsHour, actually, about children and youth firearm deaths now exceeding vehicle accidents, which is really tragic. And as we look at that social aspect, I think it's really important to recognize that, things are changing, and the study has got some deep roots in how we're changing, which I think is really interesting. What about when we talk about gun storage, did you see anything in the study or during the process about the role of secure gun storage in reducing lethal accidents or firearm suicides? Anything about that?
Well, yeah, actually that was a section in our study, and there is some research on that. It can certainly save lives if they're separated, one of the firearms from the gun. At the same time, there's concern that quite often kids seem to know the passwords, and they know how to get into the safe. So, it's a matter of parents really making sure that their kids are, monitoring to make sure their kids are not feeling angry, that are a danger to themselves or danger to others. And that is why when we were interviewing police, that they supported extreme risk protection orders, which it would remove firearms temporarily, not forever, but for anyone who is considered a danger to themselves or to others, because that can save lives.
I think we've got time for probably one more before we start to wrap up. And as I scan through, thank you everybody for your questions, because there are quite a few out there. But I think this one is really an interesting one for us to leave this discussion with is, what about how much is this really impacting our communities from the aspect of healthcare costs, lost wages, loss of pay throughout the state, not necessarily throughout the country, but yes, I mean, epidemics have a way of cascading into other areas of our lives. Is that something that you took a look at also in the study, and can you speak to it?
Yes, and trying to find actual data on that's very difficult. And by the way, we also wanted to interview psychologists and school counselors and people in the ERs and medical, just to see, you know, first to see, are firearms impacting these various areas, and also, you know, are emergency room treatments for gunshot wounds that might not, you know, we want to know, were they actually getting recorded? And yes, they actually were getting reported to the police, but they would not report any information out to the public. So if you want to get data on, you know, the injuries and murders, it has to be through the police departments, actually BCA. But yeah, we couldn't find actual data on, there's various websites that you can find where they can approximate how much the cost is, but even then with the cost, you can imagine the pain and discomfort that people may have that affect whether they can continue to do the job they had before they got injured with a gunshot wound.
Okay, so we've got a lot of league members, I'm sure, on the call tonight, and probably several people who are going to be showing up to the council this weekend on the 30th. I think that's this weekend. Is there any reason why we would not want to approve this? I mean, it seems kind of like a slam dunk, like these 3 amendments to the basic update are a good first step for us to improve our position, but that's just me. Do you have any final words on that?
You're asking the wrong one, because that's one that everyone on the committee agreed with.
Oh.
And so but at the same time, you know, it's important for people to know why the revisions, and that's part of the reason for wanting to make sure that we can reach out to their local leagues and share this information.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Marty, for your time tonight and for your committee's important work on this update to the league study, and also for your long tenure with the league and all of your civic engagement.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
So as we wrap up then tonight, I just want to leave you with a reminder that we have elections coming up. It's primary year here in Minnesota, and our primary is on August 9th. Early voting starts on June 24th. The general election is November 8th, with early voting starting on September 23rd. So look for candidate forums and voter guides on vote411.org. We are here to help you make informed decisions. We hope to see you next month on Tuesday, May 24th at 7 p.m. for another exciting topic, abortion, let's clear the air. So please join us for that. Thank you also to the League of Women Voters Roseville area and the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area, and especially to the League of Women Voters St. Paul Program Committee, my colleagues, for all the hard work behind the scenes for this program and all the programming throughout the year. Also to SPNN, St. Paul Neighborhood Network, and SCCTV, Suburban Cable Television. Thank you to the attendees joining for tonight and for your great questions. A survey will pop up. Please, please complete this, and we do go through them to reflect on your feedback for future programs. Have a great night.